Liyana Razeem, Haris Razeem, and Darian Razeem seemed like the foundation of a respected Malaysian family, but behind their polished image was a secret so forbidden it shattered every bond of trust. An affair between a wife and her father-in-law that spiraled into betrayal, rage, and a double murder no one saw coming. Liyana Razeem carried herself with quiet elegance, a woman whose life appeared steady and ordinary to those who knew her. She lived in a quiet suburb of Kuala Lumpur, in a modest house with her husband Haris Razeem. From the outside, their marriage seemed peaceful, even enviable. Haris worked long hours as an accountant, providing for their small household with diligence and a calm presence that neighbors described as dependable. Liyana, often seen tending to the garden or shopping at the market, appeared every bit the devoted wife, always smiling politely and keeping her personal life private. To anyone who looked from a distance, there was nothing unusual about them. Yet beneath this surface of stability, shadows were forming that no one could have predicted. The Razeem family carried with it an air of tradition. Haris's father, Darian Razeem, was a man who commanded respect. A retired businessman, he had built his reputation on discipline and control. People in the community saw him as stern but wise, a man who had guided many with his strict advice. Darian visited his son and daughter-in-law often, claiming it was to check on them, though his presence had begun to feel less like support and more like authority. His voice carried weight, and his opinions often shaped the direction of their home. Haris, out of loyalty, welcomed his father without question, but Liyana noticed the ways in which Darian's influence seeped into their daily life, and it stirred emotions in her she did not fully understand. Liyana had married young, her life shaped by expectations of being the ideal wife. At first, she found comfort in Haris's gentle nature, his patience, and his simple dreams. But as time passed, Haris's devotion to his work consumed much of his energy. He often returned home late, tired and quiet, his mind focused on numbers and deadlines. Though he was faithful, his love became routine, predictable, and absent of passion. For Liyana, this absence grew into a void she could not ignore. She longed for excitement, for a spark that would remind her she was alive beyond her duties as a wife. It was in this vulnerable space that Darian's presence began to take root in a dangerous way. Darian was everything Haris was not. He carried confidence, a sharpness in his voice, and an intensity that drew attention whenever he entered a room. Though older, his authority felt powerful, and he spoke to Liyana in a way that made her feel seen. What began as harmless conversation shifted into something heavier, layered with tension. A lingering look, a word that carried more weight than it should, the kind of moments that might have seemed small but left Liyana restless, long after they ended. The more time Darian spent in their home, the more Liyana felt herself pulled toward him, despite the danger. She fought to dismiss her own thoughts, convincing herself that she was imagining the connection. Yet, each visit seemed to add to the unspoken bond that was growing between them. She began dressing more carefully on the days she expected him to visit, noticing the way his eyes lingered a moment too long. Every gesture, every accidental touch, deepened the silent current that ran beneath the surface of their family. To the outside world, Liyana continued to play the role of the dutiful wife. She smiled at neighbors, attended community gatherings, and stood beside Haris at family events. But inside, she was unraveling. The guilt of her feelings weighed heavily on her, yet the thrill it gave her became addictive. Each day she told herself she would control it, and each day she found herself falling deeper. This hidden side of her life was invisible to Haris, who trusted her completely. He remained unaware of the silent war raging inside his wife, blind to the storm brewing between the two people he cared about most. What seemed like a perfect marriage on the outside was slowly transforming into something dangerous, something that would one day spill into the open, with devastating consequences. Liyana's secret desires, ignited in the shadows of her father-in-law's presence, were setting the stage for a tragedy that no one in the Razeem family could have imagined. As the months moved forward, the small sparks of connection between Liyana Razeem and Darian Razeem began to grow into flames she could no longer control. What had started as fleeting glances and unspoken tension soon became the focus of her thought. She found herself waiting for the sound of his car in the driveway, her heart racing in ways it never did for her husband, Haris. The routine of her marriage felt suffocating compared to the excitement of Darian's presence. His words carried a force that seemed to pull her closer, and every moment spent near him left her drowning in emotions. She could neither deny nor fully admit. Mira Alvian, her closest friend, noticed these changes before anyone else. Mira had always admired Liyana's calm nature and the way she carried herself with composure. But now, she observed nervous laughter, restless eyes, and sudden excuses to leave gatherings early. Liyana seemed distracted, as though her mind was constantly somewhere else. Mira tried to ask questions in subtle ways, but Liyana brushed them aside with vague answers, insisting she was simply tired or busy. Deep down, however, Mira sensed a secret that her friend was unwilling to share. Haris, buried in his long hours at work, noticed shifts as well. His wife, once attentive to the small details of their home, seemed detached. Meals were sometimes late, and conversations that used to flow quietly between them were reduced to silence. When he asked if she was all right, she assured him everything was fine, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Haris wanted to believe her words, but a shadow of doubt began to creep into his thoughts. Even so, his trusting nature made him dismiss his suspicions, convincing himself that her behavior was just the result of boredom or stress. Meanwhile, Darian saw Liyana's vulnerability as an opportunity. He thrived on control, and the thrill of holding a secret bond with his son's wife made him feel powerful. He began to test boundaries more openly, standing a little too close, brushing her hand when passing objects, and lowering his voice in a way that carried meaning only she understood. Each act chipped away at the walls Liyana tried to build, and each time she surrendered a little more to the pull of his presence. The secrecy of their connection heightened its intensity. Moments of stolen time felt dangerous, yet intoxicating. Liyana started planning her days around Darian's visits, creating excuses to meet him under the guise of family errands or household tasks. Her conscience tormented her, but the rush was stronger than the guilt. The line between right and wrong blurred, until it seemed irrelevant, overshadowed by the hunger for something she could not resist. Their reckless behavior did not go unnoticed forever. Mira grew increasingly worried as Liyana became more distant and less careful. She once saw Liyana leaving a cafe where Darian had been spotted, and though she could not confirm anything, the image haunted her. Mira wrestled with whether to confront her again or to warn Haris, but fear of destroying her friend's life kept her silent. In the Razeem household, tension began to thicken. Haris felt the weight of something shifting beneath the surface, though he could not pinpoint what it was. The atmosphere between Liyana and his father grew strained, as though they were hiding words left unsaid. Haris, still loyal to both, pushed the unease aside, hoping time would restore peace. But in doing so, he unknowingly allowed the dangerous bond between his wife and father to grow unchecked. For Liyana, each passing day was a mixture of exhilaration and dread. She found herself caught in a spiral where Darian's dominance gave her a sense of power, yet the thought of discovery filled her with terror. She lived in constant contradiction, craving the secret affair while fearing the moment it would be exposed. What neither she nor Darian realized was that their carelessness was beginning to leave traces, small signs that would eventually lead Haris toward the truth. The affair that once felt thrilling was transforming into a ticking clock, counting down toward an inevitable disaster that none of them could stop. One evening, Haris Razeem left his office earlier than usual, weary from the endless hours of balancing accounts and managing deadlines. As he drove home through the bustling Kuala Lumpur streets, he imagined the comfort of his house, the calm of his wife waiting for him, and the normalcy of their quiet routines. But when he entered his home, small details immediately unsettled him. A glass out of place on the table, the faint scent of cologne that was not his, and the hurried look in Liyana's eyes when she saw him standing in the doorway. None of it seemed alarming on its own, but together they struck him with unease he could not explain. At first, he tried to brush off the feeling, convincing himself that fatigue was playing tricks on his mind. But as days passed, more signs appeared. Liyana became more distracted, her phone always close to her, her movements hurried and secret. She seemed restless in his presence, her attention slipping away as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Haris, a man known for his calmness, began to feel an undercurrent of suspicion that gnawed at him quietly. Mira Alvian, ever observant, noticed the changes too. She had grown increasingly uneasy about Liyana's strange behavior. When she visited, she felt a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Liyana avoided direct eye contact, her words quick and defensive, her smiles forced. Mira considered pressing her friend harder, but fear held her back. She sensed that whatever was happening was bigger than she could manage. She even thought of confiding in Haris, but hesitated, not wanting to be the one responsible for tearing apart a family. The cracks widened one evening when Haris decided to follow his instinct. Darian had mentioned an errand in town, and Haris, acting on impulse, decided to keep an eye on his father. What he discovered shattered every part of him. From a distance, hidden in the shadows of a street lined with shops, he saw his father and his wife together. Their gestures left no room for doubt, an intimacy that should never have existed between them. A hand that lingered too long, a closeness that spoke louder than words, and the unmistakable truth staring him in the face. The betrayal struck Haris like a physical blow. His chest tightened, his legs felt weak, and for a moment he could not breathe. His father, the man he respected and trusted, had broken a bond more sacred than any, and his wife, the woman he devoted his life to, had become part of the same betrayal. The quiet man who had always avoided conflict, now found himself consumed by anger so intense, it left him trembling. Haris returned home in silence that night, his mind a storm of emotions. Rage clashed with grief, humiliation with disbelief. He sat in the darkened living room, long after Liyana had gone to bed, staring at the walls that once felt safe, but now seemed like a cage. The thought of confronting them crossed his mind, but he imagined their denials, their lies, their attempts to twist the truth. He wanted proof so undeniable that their betrayal could never be hidden. Over the following days, Haris became more withdrawn. He watched Liyana with careful eyes, noting her hurried movements, her nervous glances, her absences that she explained with shallow excuse. He looked at his father with a new coldness, masking his fury behind a silence that concealed the storm inside him. Neither of them noticed the change. They believed their secret was still safe, unaware that Haris had already seen everything. The discovery poisoned every part of Haris's work. The meals he shared with Liyana felt hollow, the family visits with his father unbearable. He replayed the image of them together endlessly, each time feeling the wound cut deeper. His life, once built on quiet stability, had collapsed into chaos. He no longer saw his home as a place of peace, but as the stage of his humiliation. Beneath his calm exterior, something darker was forming, a decision that would turn the betrayal into tragedy. What had begun as suspicion had transformed into certainty, and certainty left him with only one thought: vengeance. Haris Razeem's nights became endless storms of thought. Sleep abandoned him, replaced by visions of betrayal replaying again and again in his mind. The faces of his wife and his father, entwined in a secret that mocked his loyalty, consumed every waking moment. He had built his life on trust, and now that trust had been torn apart in the most humiliating way imaginable. His anger grew heavier with each passing day, pressing down on him until he felt he could not breathe. What once defined him as a quiet and patient man was crumbling, replaced by something darker, sharper and desperate. At first, Haris considered confronting them. He imagined demanding answers, forcing them to admit the truth. But then he pictured their lies, the possibility of denial, the shame of seeing them stand united against him. The thought twisted his stomach. In his mind, words no longer had value. Words had allowed the deception to grow in silence. Only action could reclaim the dignity and respect he had lost. He convinced himself that the only way to end the torment was to destroy the very source of his pain. In the days that followed,
Haris began to plan in secret. He hid his emotions from Liyana, speaking less, observing more. She mistook his silence for indifference, believing her double life remained undetected. Darian, confident in his control, showed no signs of caution either. To both of them, Haris was still the same quiet man who avoided conflict. They did not realize the storm that was building behind his steady gaze. The opportunity came on a night when the rain poured heavily, drowning the city in shadows. Haris returned home earlier than usual, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The silence in the house was strange, broken only by the muffled sound of voices upstairs. He followed the sound, his hands clenched, his heart beat loud in his ears. When he opened the door, the sight before him confirmed everything he already knew but had prayed might not be true. Liyana and Darian were together, their closeness undeniable, their betrayal carved into the very air. Haris froze in the doorway, the moment stretching into eternity. For a second there was silence, as though the house itself held its breath. Then the rage he had buried for so long erupted. He launched forward, his fury giving him a strength he had never known. The room descended into chaos. Shouts turned into screams, and the clash of struggle echoed through the walls. Haris's rage was blind, each movement fueled not by reason but by months of torment and humiliation. The storm outside raged in harmony with the storm inside the house, the thunder covering the sounds of violence, as though nature itself sought to hide the horror. By the time the chaos ended, silence had reclaimed the space. Liyana lay still, her eyes wide with shock, her body motionless. Darian, once a man of authority and dominance, was lifeless beside her. The betrayal that had poisoned Haris's soul was destroyed, but the cost was irreversible. The blood on his hands was not just theirs. It was the death of his old self, the man he once had. Haris stood in the aftermath, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The house felt suffocating, the walls closing in on him with the weight of what he had done. He stared at the bodies, at the silence that followed, and realized there was no escape from what had just occurred. The sense of victory he thought would come never arrived. Instead, emptiness filled him, a hollow echo of the man who had once believed his life was built on love and loyalty. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean but unable to cleanse the horrors inside the house. Haris sank into a chair, his mind numb, his body trembling. The plan he had created in anger was now a reality, and reality was unbearable. He understood then that his actions had ended not only two lives but also his own. What had begun as betrayal had ended in blood, and the quiet man who once lived in peace was gone forever, replaced by a murderer staring at the wreckage of his own family. The following morning, Kuala Lumpur awoke to the sound of heavy rain easing into silence, but inside the Razeem household, the stillness was suffocating. Two lifeless bodies lay in the quiet home, and Haris Razeem sat alone, drained of emotion. His hands, stained by the violence of the night before, trembled against his knees. The weight of his actions pressed on him, crushing the remnants of the man he once had been. Hours slipped away unnoticed, until the sound of sirens broke the silence. Neighbors, concerned by the commotion and the absence of movement in the house, had called the authorities. Inspector Khalid Noor arrived with his team, experienced in dealing with crime scenes, but unprepared for the disturbing reality that awaited them. As they stepped into the dimly lit living room, they were met with the smell of blood and the sight of tragedy. Liyana and Darian lay motionless, their betrayal silenced in the most brutal way. Haris, seated nearby, did not resist. He lifted his eyes slowly, meeting the gaze of the inspector with hollow acceptance. Words were unnecessary. His expression revealed everything. When questioned, Haris confessed without hesitation. His voice, calm and steady, carried no attempt at denial. He spoke of betrayal, humiliation, and the unbearable torment of knowing the two people he trusted most had destroyed him from within. For Inspector Khalid, it was not the confession that shocked him, but the sheer coldness of Haris's acceptance. There was no relief, no remorse, only emptiness. The double murder, though horrific, seemed to Haris like the inevitable conclusion to months of secrecy and pain. News of the crime spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond, shaking the community to its core. The Razeem family had always been viewed with respect, their name associated with tradition and dignity. Now, whispers filled the streets, each retelling the scandal in hushed tone. A wife entangled with her father-in-law, a husband driven to murder. Such a story was almost too unbelievable to accept. Yet the evidence was undeniable, and the truth left the community in stunned silence. Mira Alvian, upon hearing the news, felt her heart collapse under the weight of guilt. She had seen the signs, the changes in her friend, the nervous glances, and the suspicious behavior. She had suspected something but had chosen to remain silent, fearing the consequences of speaking out. Now, her silence echoed louder than any words she could have spoken. She replayed every moment she could have intervened, every chance to stop the spiral before it reached its deadly end. But regret came too late, leaving her haunted by the belief that she had failed to save her friend from herself. In court, Haris stood before the judge, his confession leaving no room for argument. The evidence aligned with his own words, painting a picture of betrayal, rage, and calculated violence. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the details emerged, each revelation darker than the last. The judge, stern and unmoved, described the case as a tragedy born not only from betrayal but also from silence. Secrets left unspoken until they erupted into bloodshed. Haris was sentenced to life in prison, his quiet future replaced with the endless confines of a cell. For the public, the case became more than just a story of murder. It was a warning about the dangerous weight of hidden desires and the devastating consequences of deceit. The image of the once respected Razeem family was shattered, their legacy reduced to scandal and sorrow. The story was told and retold, each time with disbelief that such betrayal and violence could exist within a single home. Behind prison walls, Haris lived with the reality of his choices. He had destroyed the people who betrayed him, but in doing so, he had destroyed himself. The silence of his cell mirrored the silence of the house after the murders, an echo of emptiness that never left him. The betrayal had ended in blood, but the pain continued, stretching into every day of his life behind bars. The case of Haris, Liyana and Darian remained etched into memory, a chilling reminder that beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary family, darkness can fester, unnoticed, until it erupts with devastating force. What began as secret passion ended in double murder, leaving behind a legacy not of love or loyalty but of betrayal, destruction and tragedy that would forever stain the Razeem